Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the For Food's Sake podcast. This episode we'll be talking to Mark Pershin. He's the founder and CEO of Less Meat, Less Heat. You might remember that Mark was our first guest on the For Food's Sake podcast. I interviewed him a little over a year ago, and as you might imagine, a lot has happened since then. So for those of you that don't know, Less Meat, Less Heat is an organization that promotes grassroots activism by shifting societal attitudes towards meat consumption, specifically with a focus on beef and lamb, in order to curtail agriculture's most damaging influences on global climate. They promote what's called a climatarian diet, which is a diet that very much limits your meat consumption, and they very much promote individual action. Now, Mark recently went to the COP23 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bonn in Switzerland. And so in this episode, I ask Mark a little bit about what happened during COP23, why he was there, what he saw, and what progress was made generally, and more specifically for agriculture and food. So without further ado, here is Mark Pershin. We have Mark Pershin on the line. Mark, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Matteo. I can see your podcast has gone to many fascinating places over the months since we've spoken.
Yeah, it's been a little over a year, I think, since we last talked. You were my first guest on the podcast, and a lot's definitely happened since then. I mean, I remember when we first talked, Trump hadn't been elected yet. So in terms of climate change negotiations, which will be the focus of our conversation today, a lot has definitely happened there. And you're currently, as I understand, on your way back home from Geneva. Is that correct?
I'm not actually heading home. I'm actually taking a month off. I've been looking forward to this. So going to be doing a bit of trekking in Patagonia, starting from tomorrow.
Oh wow, that's I think that's well deserved probably after that conference. I mean, we'll get into the nitty gritty, but I've been doing a bit of reading here and there, and I've got mixed feelings about how it turned out, and I'd love to hear from you what your perspective is from having been at the COP23 conference, what happened, and why you were there for the listeners out there that don't know, and what progress, if any, you saw that was made. So let's maybe start just if you could quickly describe why you were there, a few words also about Less Meat, Less Heat for those that haven't listened to the first episode of the podcast. And yeah, maybe some of your first impressions of the conference, and then we can get a little bit more into detail about agriculture and food.
Sure. Well, so my name is Mark Pershin. I'm the founder and CEO of Less Meat, Less Heat. And Less Meat, Less Heat is an organization that's dedicated to addressing climate change through diet change. Unfortunately, it's still, even 2.5 years on, very much overlooked by the global climate movement and our geopolitical reaction to climate change. So that's pretty much why I was there. I mean, most of my efforts with Less Meat, Less Heat are really focused on grassroots and just mobilizing behavior change around the world with various volunteers around the world. But I do dabble into the geopolitical side of things as well. So COP21 was my first, and this is my second COP. I was there, I guess after COP21, I kind of made a vow to myself that I actually wouldn't return, because the injustice of it all just really disgusted me and really hit me hard. Even though the Paris Agreement was a success, just the sheer injustice of it all in terms of the countries that had contributed the least were being asked to change in drastic ways and being given very little money to do so. And on top of that, we're being faced unequally with the climate impacts on an ongoing and an increasing basis, and giving very little from the global north to actually address the damages from climate change. So yeah, I didn't think I'd be back, but I found myself in Europe, and this opportunity came up, so I figured it wasn't that big of an expense because it was just a very quick flight over, and I decided why not? I'll come along and see what's changed and see how this is different. So that's why I decided to come. Just the opportunity turned up, and and on top of that, actually this time we actually had had two people from Let's Meet Let's Eat attend because another ticket came up, which is fantastic.
Great. And so a chance presented itself. You went, and of course, the last one you went to, as you mentioned, was the Paris Climate Accords or COP21 2 years ago. So, could you talk a little bit about, I guess, what some of the key differences were, and if you saw that any of those injustices that you mentioned, whether you felt that any of those were being addressed? So, whether you think there's actually been any tangible progress, and whether you're perhaps more optimistic?
Well, I learned a lot at COP21. At COP21, we're ultimately trying to get agriculture on the agenda, at least the sustainable consumption of food on the agenda. And it's very much an uphill battle, as you can imagine, that it's not even really addressed in the actual negotiations themselves. Whereas this time, we tried to have more tangible goals, like rather than broadly speaking, trying to get it on the agenda, like how can we get it on the agenda? So we kind of went to the drawing board and we realized that one of the key reasons that agriculture is not really treated as the big climate solution that it is, and also the rising climate threat that it really is also not being addressed, is largely due to the way we account for greenhouse gases. So under the current system, which was basically as prescribed back in when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was formed back in 1991, we basically measured all greenhouse gases and how much of it impacts the climate over a 100-year time frame, which is perfect for gases like carbon dioxide, which lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. But it's very problematic when it comes to gases that don't last in the atmosphere for that long, like methane, which is the second biggest driver of current warming that we're feeling. And methane only lasts in the atmosphere for 10 years. So we thought, okay, let's put our heads together and let's figure out a strategy to actually call upon the UNFCCC to adopt better greenhouse gas accounting standards that really reflect the true short-term warming of methane, which we currently average it out over 100 years, 10 times its lifespan. So we underestimate short-term warming.
Oh, that's really interesting. I often get that remark that people say at least the emissions from livestock are being, drastically overestimated. That it's not such a big problem as certain documentaries. I mean, I'm thinking here specifically of Cowspiracy. A lot of people refer to that documentary. That a lot of the claims are drastically exaggerated, but it might just be, at least in part, like you mentioned, a question of, like you said, it's a question of the way you measure greenhouse gases, and if you approach it differently, you realize that there's certain elephants in the room that aren't being addressed.
Well, I'd like to address that actually. So with Cowspiracy, that documentary is an amazing documentary, and I owe a lot of the motivation for starting Let's Meet Let's Eat to that documentary. But they do use the World Watch study, which was never actually published, which is where they get the 51% figure. So that overestimates it, depending on who you ask. But under the current greenhouse gas accounting framework, it's between 11 to 15% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gases attributed to agriculture. So that's drastic underestimation because of the reasons I described in terms of how we measure the greenhouse gases. So the biggest emitter of methane is the livestock agriculture sector, mostly beef and dairy, lamb. But also in terms of the emissions that come from deforestation. So agriculture is the biggest driver of deforestation. It drives about 80% of global deforestation. And forget about palm oil. Beef drives about 70% of tropical rainforest destruction. So whereas palm oil is only about 10%. I mean, let's not forget about it, but let's put the actual true driver of deforestation on the biggest driver, which is livestock. So they also get away with that not being attributed to livestock emissions under the current accounting framework. So when you factor all those in, it's actually much higher than what it's currently given credit for, and that's what we were focused on addressing at the climate talks.
Okay, and did you find that there was any receptivity to this message? I mean, I read somewhere that in terms of agriculture, maybe not specifically livestock, but that this was the first. It was a very historic conference because it was the first climate negotiations where countries reached some form of tangible agreement on agriculture. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on what agreements were reached and how your message was received?
Sure. I mean, in terms of what we're proposing as Less Meat, Less Heat, this is quite. It's still a bit quite out of the actual negotiations. I mean, actually, no. Let me rephrase that. So, in terms of first of all, let's address what was in terms of agriculture. So, they agreed on 5 future workshops on agriculture and just an ongoing work agenda on agriculture, inclusive within the UNFCCC climate negotiations on an ongoing basis. And this is largely focused on food security and climate adaptation to agriculture. So it doesn't really touch upon the key issue why Less Meat, Less Eat exists in the first place, which is overconsumption of livestock agriculture, largely by the global north and the emerging middle class in developing countries. So this doesn't address that at all. Another thing that I saw being conflated in the UN, some of the presentations, especially by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, was this whole idea of climate smart agriculture and pushing livestock regenerative farming and holistic management as a solution to both climate change and food security, which it isn't. And all we need to do is look at the literature out there on this topic, especially Food and Climate Research Network put an incredible literature review recently called Grazed and Confused that addresses this issue very, very well. So that basically gives you a summary of what went down. So it was kind of like an agreement for future work, and nothing was actually really negotiated from that perspective. I mean, it's definitely a step in the right direction, but it doesn't address overconsumption at all.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. Just to cut in here quickly, I'm just, I guess, astounded that they don't seem to make the link between issues of food security and climate-resistant crops and all of these issues, which, you know, are real issues, obviously, and the problem of livestock. Like, for me, they're intrinsically interlinked. One very much connects to the other, and it's just astounds me that the only I guess solution they're going for is regenerative agriculture, which might be, I mean, in my humble opinion, a very small part of the solution, but it's definitely clear that we need to cut down on meat consumption drastically, and we need to head towards, I mean, to some extent, if not a large extent, a plant-based diet that moves away from, especially, you know, as we talked about, you know, red meat ruminants. It's just, I find it fascinating that they can separate the two.
Yeah, well, a big part of this is actually a push by industry. So UNFAO is very much driven by industry expansion, and especially industrial livestock agriculture expansion into developing countries under the guise of improving food security by adding more protein to their diets. And we all know that meat is not the only form of protein, and it's also the biggest carbon-emitting form of protein as well. So it's very sinister what they're doing there, and there's some really good articles I'd recommend reading. Like, if you Google "Climate Smart Agriculture Unmasked," it was written by a group of indigenous organizations, actually. Literally unmasking what climate smart agriculture actually is, and it's just another form of colonialism. Really, it's I mean, ultimately we need to be supporting subsistence farmers, smallholder farmers, and that kind of thing, and especially especially away from carbon emitting, more intensification of carbon emitting production like livestock.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sorry, I cut you off earlier. You were talking as well about, so you mentioned the agreement, or at least the consensus that was reached about agriculture, but with Less Meat, Less Heat, what was I guess your mission at COP23? Did you have a specific agenda? What would you like to see being discussed more honestly, and I guess what's your strategy when you come to these international negotiations?
Well, yeah, we'll go back to what I was talking about before in terms of measurement, and the main reason why agriculture is not really given the space that it should at these negotiations is back to measurement. So we launched a coalition called the Put Climate on Paws Coalition. The name may be changed, but the website is up. We've got about 13 member NGO organizations, including Carbon Market Watch, ProVeg International, and just to name a few. And also 4 scientists on board, including contributors to the IPCC report, like Professor Robert Hobart from Cornell University, for instance. And this basically breaks that down exactly what we're asking the UN to adopt, which is a better accounting framework that truly represents the true short-term impact of short-lived climate pollutants such as methane. Long-term, we'd like to call upon them for better attribution of deforestation emissions as well. But for now, this is the first ask, and we're basically trying to get country delegations on board to support this proposal in between now and the intersessionals, which will be held in Bonn again in May. And ultimately, the Paris rulebook, which is what is currently being negotiated, will conclude negotiations at COP24 in Poland in December. So we've ultimately got a year to achieve this objective with this coalition. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think we're off to a good start, and we've got some amazing people involved already, and it's great to see this grow so quickly and organically. And I'm really excited about this coalition.
That's fantastic. It's good to hear some positive news and that there's some progress, at least amongst the actors you mentioned. Are there any nation states that have shown more interest, or bigger organizations that have shown more interest into this type of thinking, into this type of approach, or is it very much at the moment reserved to academic institutions and NGOs?
There's definitely been some interest. So there is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and they held a meeting around metrics in March. With the report hasn't been published yet, but one of my colleagues from that coalition is going to send me one across soon. So we've been approaching some of their member states, including like Ivory Coast and Chile and Mexico, who are really progressive in the area of short-lived climate pollutants, which is great. So I'm hoping that there will be. So far, they have shown some interest, but yeah. So there's still a lot of work to do in terms of figuring out how we're going to get this on the table. But I think so far it's promising. And there's about, from the top of my head, there's about 54 country delegations that are part of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And we're going to basically be knocking on all of those doors, which we've already knocked on quite a few. So we'll be following all those up over the next coming months.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that you mentioned, it seems to be mainly emerging markets and developing countries that are more interested in this than some of the, I guess, the large, at least traditional polluters, whether it's the US or Western Europe. Could you maybe touch, I guess another one of the enormous elephants in the room for both COP22 and COP23, like I mentioned in my introduction, was, the election of Donald Trump. I know that COP22 in Marrakesh was largely overshadowed by the US elections, which were taking part at that time. Did you feel that COP23 was still very much overshadowed by the fact that the US has at least... Donald Trump announced last year or even this year that he would be, that they would be withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords. Did you see that influencing the negotiations a lot and the general mood at COP23?
Yes and no. So, first of all, we need to clarify that the US haven't actually withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, and they cannot actually officially withdraw until the day after the next US election, which is quite comical when you think about it. I'm hoping, like many of you and your listeners, that the next president will be hopefully a Democrat, or even if it is another Republican, then hopefully it'll be someone that actually sees the writing on the wall from a climate perspective and decides to stay within the Paris Accord. So I remain hopeful that the next person elected will cancel that executive order and remain in the Paris Agreement. The US were still at most of the negotiations, at least the ones I was allowed to observe. and perhaps they weren't. I guess the big difference I saw with COP23 versus COP21 was the US not taking on that leadership role in the actual negotiations, and rather taking quite a bit of a backseat in a lot of these negotiations. I mean, this does, however, open up that role to other countries like China to come along, and we did see a little bit of that, but we have to see what happens over the next between now and COP24. In terms of it would actually be quite interesting to see whether the UN does address the non-state actors' call to actually join these climate talks from a state perspective, because US, as you know, is one of the world's biggest emitters, and if they're pulling out of the Paris Accord, however, if 50% of their economy, which are the We're Still In coalition, firmly saying we want to act like we're still in the Paris Agreement, we actually want to be part of these negotiations because we want to be progressive. Who knows? Maybe the UN might turn around and let them, which would, I'm not sure how that would work, but I think anything's possible these days, and it was quite interesting seeing that that coalition come out in full force, and it was very inspiring seeing all their talks actually, especially Governor Jerry Brown and some of the work they're doing in California around short-lived climate pollutants like black carbon and methane emissions in California.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, at least from reading about the COP23 negotiations, that was what was most fascinating for me. It was that, like you mentioned, the We Are Still In coalition on the one side, so U.S. states and cities and businessmen and civil society that are very much about staying in the accords. And on the other hand, I heard about the U.S. presentation on fossil fuels, and that there was an enormous boycott of them essentially trying to promote fossil fuels. And I read this brilliant article that compared it to it basically being like promoting cigarettes at a cancer prevention summit, that it was just the most outrageous. I mean, could you comment a little on that? Were you at that presentation, or, I mean, did you boycott that presentation, or was there, what happened there?
Oh my God. I ended up going to another presentation. I tried to get in, but the line was so big. Like, people had been lining up for hours, so I thought there's no way I'll be able to get in. Besides, one of my colleagues was in there running the boycott, helping run the boycott. And I did see the video later, and it was great to see. It was just amazing seeing the whole room stop the presentation and sing that song about keeping it in the ground. And I loved it. It was great. I mean, it's so ridiculous that this is even allowed to happen at the climate talks. I mean, the World Health Organization put in that firewall between them and the tobacco industry, so the tobacco industry wouldn't be able to influence any of their negotiations a long time ago, or at least several years ago. I don't understand why the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change can't do the same with the fossil fuel industry, which is the biggest driver of climate change. So, yeah. and as well as agriculture industry as well. So I don't understand why this is even allowed to happen. But yeah, it's beyond ridiculous. I mean, I was. If I had the time to prepare, my own personal idea for an action would have been to dress up as a Marlboro man and stand out the front and hand out cancer-free cigarettes, because the title of their presentation was Clean Coal, so it would have been quite perfect. Yeah.
No, maybe you can do that for the next one, COP24. I mean, if Trump is still president, I'm sure there'll be plenty more boycotts to be had.
Yeah. I'll start coming up with some ideas.
We can start brainstorming now. Okay, Mark, are there any final words you have for the listeners out there in terms of, anything really, COP23 related, or just generally speaking?
I mean, at the end of the day, this is, as the name suggests, it's a 23rd Conference of Parties. So 23 years we've been negotiating on climate change, and we've got an agreement that will, with the current nationally determined contributions, won't really keep us below 2 degrees, let alone 3.5 degrees. So we should not wait for world leaders to act on climate change. The real change starts on the grassroots. We need to act now, and it's already happening all around. So all your listeners, get involved with your local climate groups. Host a climatarian dinner. Take part in the climatarian challenge. Get involved in small-scale local renewables wherever you are in the world. this ultimately, the change has to come from the grassroots, and we shouldn't wait for world leaders, and we can start that now.
I couldn't agree more, Mark. Thanks so much for all the work you do and for keeping up the good fight. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your time in the middle of your transferring in Santiago right now. Enjoy your holidays. They're very much deserved. And I'll talk to you soon.
No worries. I know it's a bit of a carbon-heavy holiday, but I'll make up for it with lots of tree planting, I promise.
That's good. That's great. Thanks a lot, Mark.
No worries. Thanks, Matteo. Speak soon.
If you want to hear more about what Less Meat, Less Heat is up to, what Mark Pershin's currently focusing on, what happened in COP23, and if you want to look at any of the articles that Mark mentioned or that we briefly talked about, all of that is provided in the show notes below. So that's it for this week, a nice short episode. If you'd like to support the podcast, as always, you can do so by subscribing via iTunes, by rating and reviewing via iTunes, and of course by following us on all our social media platforms. Our handle for all of those platforms is For Food's Sake Me. You can stream all of the episodes on the website at www.forfoodsake.me. And of course, you can share the episode and the podcast with friends and family. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you next time.